we've got all these idiots who are like, look at the data. And it's like, they don't know what they're looking at. Stop telling them to look at the data. Stop telling them to go on PubMed. They need textbooks. They need secondary sources. Like, Jesus, help these people. And again, in a perfect world, everyone would be a genius with a PhD in statistical analysis, and they'd be able to sift through the data themselves. But 99% of trainers can barely read. So I'm just grateful that they'll even pick up a secondary source of scientific information. People are just, and I'm a pretty utopian guy at times as well, but it's so utopian to be like, wouldn't it be nice? And it's just a classic, wouldn't it be nice if everyone could read all that research to inform every single training decision? Or wouldn't it be nice if we actually had robust bodies of evidence? But again, we're so insecure about the shit place that this industry has come from that we're hoping that sports science can do the work for us in like 10 years. I know sports science has been going on for longer than that, but speaking to this evidence-based era where it really has been a central focus, it's like, man, in 50 years, we're going to have some decent data. But again, I think when we get the data, what you're going to see is that you don't get as many clear answers. Again, the data is just going to be all over the place until you torture it, pin it down, and just shape it, massage it. It sort of shows you that you need a Nord board and a bunch of force plates and a specific diet to match up with your whatever. And
welcome back, gang. We got a fun one, a very social media influenced possible stand-up comedy episode for you here. Drew, who we got?
Angus Bradley joins us today, all the way from Australia. Angus, I got to say, this is probably the most that I've laughed at a conversation. He'll say it himself. He identifies as a personal trainer. And in addition to just being absolutely prolific on social media, he hosts the Hyperformance podcast. That's Hyperformance or High Performance. He started off very much in the Olympic lifting space, which you'll hear a few references to. But now he trains a wider variety of athletes, ranging from gym pop to professional level. One of the quotes he drops is that he can't get on LinkedIn because he's never had a proper job. And then prior to getting into this space, he identified as a rock star and a surfer. So sort of your quintessential Australian, if you will. But the reason we wanted to get him on, and one of the things that I think you will find if you do correctly choose to follow him on Instagram, is that he likes to expose and discuss a lot of the kind of frameworks and ideas that the industry clings to for, good, better, or worse. And he does it in a way that is incredibly unique, incredibly humorous. And like I said, we probably laughed more recording this episode than we have in just about any other conversation we've done.
There's some like serious nuggets of wisdom in here. I had to like pause to just absorb things a couple times when we were talking about it, but we were also laughing our asses off throughout. I think it was a really engaging conversation. You figure out quickly why this guy has succeeded in kind of capturing an audience and driving some discussion around some of these challenges. It was a really enjoyable conversation to have. And I've shared it before, so you guys might have already seen Angus's stuff, but I would definitely point you that way. Check out more of it and check out his podcast as well. Enjoy. You turn out multiple episodes a week, right?
2 a week. And we, not officially, but we dropped our 300th upload, let's say, last week, but I think technically it's episode 270 because those are just a bunch of unnumbered episodes that were just sort of shit talk episodes. We've only just started numbering those episodes recently. You'd be like, oh no, this is still an episode.
It's pretty sweet. You've been in the game a long time.
Well, to do any of these things, you have to commit to it for at least 5 years. Otherwise, anyone who does a podcast for less than 5 years and says that podcasting doesn't work is an idiot.
Drew, he just laid down the gauntlet for us.
No, all right. I got to ask you, when did you become such a savage in terms of just going after BS in the fitness industry? How did that start for you? Because I love it.
Started before I was in the fitness industry. So I found out that I take everything personally. And my brother became a personal trainer in my senior years of high school, and I was always a skinny kid. So naturally, when I stepped into a gym, there are all these jocks and just all these overconfident trainers who were just always so comfortable to give me all this advice. And I always, self-identified as a bit more of a critical thinker, stuff like that. So I was a big skeptic even coming into the fitness industry, because again, it is an emerging field. And I noticed that just the practices seem to be changing in real time. And so, I came into the industry just as sports science was really starting to emerge, or this concept of evidence-based sort of practice. And so, even just coming in, I just viewed it as a space that was sort of dominated by charlatans and things like that. And I think that's what made me confident just coming in. And it's weird, even when I say it out loud, I'm like, wow, I sounded almost like entitled. But I came into the industry with no respect for it, but also by the same token, I didn't feel like anyone was obligated to respect me. Because again, it's relatively new to the industry. Who's this skinny guy? What does he really have to offer? But and that's sort of, I guess, that conflict or that contradiction is now what I'm sort of trying to navigate. Because I think you guys would agree that we are in this industry where, people say, oh yeah, been in the game for 20 years, but it's just like, what the fuck does that even mean in a space like this?
Dude, my favorite quote, I don't know if I've said this on the podcast or not, but specific to, I think this was college sports. I'm not sure, but it was this idea that 20 years of experience is realistically just the same year repeated 20 times. And that
for most people,
brilliant. Yeah.
Especially in the fitness industry, it's like, all right, 20 years experience. You're like, I know what certs you did.
Who is let's kickstart this early. You talked about charlatans. Who is your biggest charlatan?
It's a hard question.
No, it's not. It's just
no, it's not.
I think that this industry is still trying to crawl out from this Poliquin rock. It's been,
knew you were going that way.
Overshadowing this industry. And like I said, I think there were some crazy positive contributions, because I think the field was so primitive. And I think that's why Poliquin was able to dominate it in certain ways, because he did give it a lot of structure in a certain sense, the personal training space. A lot of people just weren't even writing programs for their clients and things like that. So he's like, look, here's how you write programs. But then it was just too much of the specific stuff, as the evidence has played out, turns out he may not have been as ahead of the science as he claimed to be, which is just such a bold claim. But then, like I said, in certain ways he was, but it was just sort of by luck or by chance. But then again, like I said, you look at a lot of the emerging fitness systems, still the big ones, and a lot of them still just credit Poliquin. I'm like, I think we need to move on from this. And again, when you look at some of the most toxic heuristics that have been perpetuated, especially in the personal training space. No, I guess it was personal training and the strength and conditioning space, like this idea of the interference effect, or more precisely, that cardio is going to kill your gains. How many stressed out corporates with high blood pressure hired someone as a health consultant, because that's essentially what a personal trainer is. You're paying money to improve health outcomes, is my general understanding of the role. And they got told, no, stop doing that dumb cardio. Hey, you need to up the amount of meat you're eating every day. And then they just keel over at their desk after having a heart attack. It's just like, I don't think what those people needed to hear was that cardio would kill your gains, or that's the big dirty one, I guess.
You made a great comment at the beginning of joining the industry without a lot of respect for it, but not expecting you to necessarily be respected right off the bat either. And I don't remember exactly when I discovered your page, but I have shared content from it kind of routinely for the last several months. And one of the first times I did that, I got one of my favorite DMs of all time, which was from someone saying, why should we listen to this Angus guy? He's just a comedian. I
totally agree. Yeah.
He's just a comedian.
I actually like that, because I've realized recently how important it is for me to make people laugh. Because then even if I do accidentally spout some bullshit, it's like, well, at least we had a laugh along the way. And that's my issue. A lot of these charlatans take themselves way too seriously. Whereas, my idea is I just want to be this benevolent guru, I guess. It's like, hopefully we can all just laugh along the way, even if I end up being wrong. Because I'm very open to the idea of being wrong. And I've had that comment from so many Australian S&C big dogs as well. They're like, who are you for all us to listen to? I'm like, no, I do not expect you to respect my opinion or my take on this at all. But like, maybe just consider what I said and see if you can reconcile it with some other appeal to authority.
Well, I think there's this whole something I've like thought about a bunch and people asking about all the time. Social media does not reward quality information. Like if you've been in the game for even a little bit, you know that like good content is not what gets rewarded. Picking fights or saying something funny, those kinds of things get rewarded. And I think something like all of us struggle with a little bit is trying to figure out how do we guide people or help people recognize good stuff in this game where like, I don't like there's so much disagreement over what's true and what's more important and all of that stuff. I've liked yours, and I think it's really interesting that like your content for the most part is literally just like a couple sentences of text on a black screen making a bullet point that'll get people fired up a little bit. And I don't know how to like describe to people what to look for when they're looking for good content, but
Benevolent
I've
gurus.
loved a lot of yours.
Well, and this sort of, I think, speaks to me studying journalism at uni and sort of like, essentially that's a degree in creating propaganda. And also in terms of how I go about, because I think about that as well, because, sports science and the hierarchy of evidence, I think is really, really good, but we very much have an emerging body of evidence. And I don't want to be constrained just to operating within that. Like I want to have respect for that. But then I think the other way I try to vet information is just by cross-referencing. And again, I think we sort of touched on, maybe it was before we hit record, I feel like everyone in the fitness industry stays too much in their individual silos, whereas I feel like I've got closer and closer, at least from a human movement perspective and training practices perspective, to the quote unquote truth by looking at what the top track and field coaches are saying, or the ones that I like at least, and cross-referencing that with what the top weightlifting coaches say, and then what some of the top powerlifting coaches say, and just trying to consolidate everything. So I guess it's very much like this investigative journalism sort of approach to it. And I must admit, like I do have a bit of a hyper fixation on the fitness industry. So I am just obsessed with, even when I was just sort of consuming, sort of practicing a lot of Olympic weightlifting, when that was my central training focus, I was always really interested in like, what are training practices in MMA, even outside of like fitness specific stuff. Like I think martial arts coaches and like, again, track and field skills coaches, like they really understand human movement in a far more sophisticated way, even if they don't have as sophisticated means of expressing it or communicating it in our like really not fitness industry specific jargon. I think there's a lot of value we get from interfacing with them.
When you mentioned kind of going to these different, I think that's incredibly important, especially for sort of our population, because with military athletes, it's like you do have to take from everywhere. But as you've done that, what are kind of some emerging or some consistent things that you've seen hold true regardless of the silo, so to speak?
Well, I believe that all human movement is gait. Like I think you can all just boil it down to that. Overwhelmingly, like I'm not sure how much you guys have been aware of the compression expansion model, but which has been quite a controversial model. But again, I feel like from all the different sources I've been to, that Bill Hartman's compression expansion model is sort of the most general human movement model that seems to encapsulate a lot of what all these different people are trying to say. And yeah, we just have these yielding patterns and then these overcoming patterns. So the yielding patterns are, generally speaking, flexion, abduction, external rotation. And then the propulsive patterns are extension, adduction, and internal rotation. And, whether you're looking at like a clean or a squat, or whether you're having a look at a sprinter and when they're pushing into the ground versus when they're in the swing phase, I think you see a lot of these patterns are more similar than different. So I think that's a real big one. Just this idea of like everything does fit into just swing and stance at the end of the day. Might look a little bit different because I know people are already saying like, but Angus, I know there's more than two forms of human movement. And I think it's like the differences emerge based on the structure, the differences in the structure of the individual and the differences in the constraints of the task. But ultimately, again, it is just yielding and overcoming actions. Oh, and sorry, one more thing I would say, overwhelmingly, people put way too much structure into their training planning, just so it's not all human movement based.
So I like that because that kind of feeds into what I was going to ask here. As Drew was asking that, I was thinking I'm I'm less curious about what you found as like the cohesive guiding philosophy kind of thing. And I'm more interested in what are some things that you took to be true as you started learning in the field that you've like since found to be unhelpful or harmful or not useful or things like that?
That to produce the most force, it's all about hitting triple extension and finishing your triple extension. And that I think as a field, we have really misunderstood what a consistent stimulus is, or what a relatively consistent stimulus is, and how much structure is required to make progress over time for various populations. I think when I came into the fitness industry, again, I was sort of really looking at like this bro science era. And then I thought I was getting out ahead of everyone by looking at, that was when everyone started really fetishizing USSR style periodization, where, they'd map out these elaborate training plans. You'd be like, all right, I'm going to do 4 weeks of this and 85%. And then the second week, it's going to be 87%. And then, 8 weeks into it, that's when, that phase will have sort of run out. It's not going to be as stimulative anymore. So we're going to move on to this phase. This is the perfect sort of thing. And got this phasic sort of structure, phasic potentiation sort of built into it. And now I'm sort of like, it's, human needs don't, because a program ultimately should just be reflective of a human's needs. And it's pretty rare that someone goes to bed with certain needs and then wakes up with completely different needs. Or again, like, I just think it's a misnomer to think that you can predict a complex dynamic system made up of systems. And it's our understanding that human beings are complex dynamic systems made up of systems that don't behave predictably despite a similar environment and similar inputs. And once you acknowledge that, you probably adopt a slightly less structured and a bit more reactive approach to programming. And just for me as well, my understanding that, like, your legs don't really give a fuck where you put the bar when you're doing squats, or like, unless you're a powerlifter, it's like, that's probably still a relatively consistent stimulus. Like, I used to think that you're a lunatic if you did different exercises every week. And I thought that was the pinnacle of shithouse training. Now I'm like, I actually don't think it really matters if you high bar squat 1 week and then front squat another week. And just like, as well, I can't believe how much we romanticized USSR style periodization when, like, they got beat by the Bulgarians who just maxed out literally every day. And like, again, when we stereotype crappy training practices, we're like, oh, don't max out every day. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, that's the best periodization. That's the most successful weightlifting system we've ever seen. And people will be like, no, but it was drugs. I'm like, I think the Russians weren't doing a bit of that, drugs and complex periodization. Like, what do you mean? I'm so happy. The thing is, people, and this is why I say fuck optimal, right? Because fuck optimal, because I'm interested in what has worked, because that gives me the broadest toolbox where I'm going to be able to meet their individual needs. Where if I'm only focused on what's optimal, like, one, it's impossible to find optimal for any one individual at a population level through data. But I'm just more interested in, like, embodying these anti-fragile principles, which is, again, more economic principles of like, all right, fuck this optimal practice. There's a million ways we could go about doing this thing. It's like, what are the threats to the system? Like, what are the things that are going to fuck up my progress? And there's way less of those things than what people think.
I'm so happy.
You're making Drew. Yeah,
Alex,
Drew's
no,
so happy
this
right
is
now.
like, this is my favorite thing in the world, because, like, growing up in the industry that is literally built off the back of just random Soviet texts and periodization and percentages, and like, to even have a discussion. And Alex and I have seen this as we've even talked about it. Like, people flip out when you tell them that they can't. I say people, I mean coaches. Coaches flip out when you tell them that they can't predict someone's squat 12 weeks from now, because you take away that security blanket of like, well, if I can't use percentages, like, what am I supposed to do? Well, maybe listen to your athlete and like adjust. But that triggers the hell out of people, and it is my favorite thing to do.
That's being a guru in my eyes, thinking you can predict a human's behavior or adaptation sort of response to stress. Like, I think that is so fucking egotistical.
Well, it's creating a system. Like, you create a system because you can sell your system, and then when athletes don't fit into the system, it's their fault. And when they do, thumbs up, your system works, buy my ebook.
Yeah, 100%. It's like, and that's it. People, it's people really struggle to balance that, like having a systemized approach, because I respect that you want to have some semblance of a training product while simultaneously embracing chaos, or like working in enough flexibility in your systematic framework to be able to entertain that chaos.
Well, we also
hold on, Alex, we're on a tear here. Would you say that you can, and I know that you're going to appreciate this, Alex, because you get feedback and kickback from this all the time. Angus, would you say that you can plan without periodizing?
So periodization is an emergent quality. You don't actively do it.
Yes.
You could just go in and train and then write down what you did. And in hindsight, there would be some degree of organization to that. John Kiley, it's my understanding of periodization, at least as far as it relates to the body of research on periodization, sort of comes from him. And he was like, other than just like having some degree of organization, which just by the fact that it occurred, it must have been organized to some extent, that all the other aspects of periodization, like he found over 80 different definitions of periodization in the literature. And he's like, all of it outside of just like having some semblance of a plan sort of seems to be based around prediction. And we just want to take away all those predictive qualities, or manage as many of those predictive qualities of our training planning as possible, which we can just do by planning a little bit less and reacting more. And I think as well, this sort of feeds into like why words are important as well, because I think in so many other aspects of our life, we're rewarded for being proactive. And I think as a trainer, I was always trying to demonstrate value for my client. And it was just, I felt like a real slick operator and a bit of a guru, being like, not only can I predict how your body's going to respond to this program, but I'm going to be really proactive and write out 3 months of training for you. And I think there's some good psychological sort of benefits there. Like I think the reason to plan more is to get buy-in from the athlete, because that's another thing that John Kiley's really big on. It's like, if you believe the plan will work, it has a way higher likelihood of working, from like your body freeing up more resources. But also it's like, if your trainer writes out a really hard plan and you don't believe in it, it's like, are you realistically going to complete it? So like, I think there are sort of, again, reasons for planning, but they're much more psychosocial than like biological or physiological.
Angus, I don't know if you know how happy you're making Drew right now.
I'm going to say, shout out John Kiley, friend of the pod. We had him on a while ago. He's my favorite.
He's the man.
But like in your answer, you both used the term emergent periodization and you invoked John Kiley's name like 3 times. Drew's having the night of his life right now.
I'm so happy.
But John Kiley won't celebrate himself, so more people need to celebrate that guy.
It's
because
true. It's so true. John, if you're listening, I've
tried to compliment him and he doesn't like it. And like I said this on David Gray's podcast last week. I was like, man, you're so brilliant. He was like, oh, no, I just think a lot. It's just like, dude, you're the man. Like he was like, he tried to take a break from coaching pro athletes to go into academia, and just like all these different world champs, like, John, will you train me? John, will you train me? So the poor bloke has to juggle this career in academia, or adjacent to academia at least, and all these world-class athletes. I'm like, and the things that he's saying are so bold that, again, when I say them, people are like, well, who the fuck have you trained? I'm like, yeah, good point. Like, good fucking point. Even though I worked with a few pro athletes now, just saying. But John Kiley's public track record is so hectic that you just have to have a bit more respect for what he's saying. Like, for some random skinny C word from Australia to be like, periodization is bullshit, that doesn't carry any weight. Whereas when John Kiley, who has worked with all these hectic athletes, is like, I'm telling you, periodization is not what they say it was. It just, yeah. And so that's what I'm saying. Like, back to your original point, like, yeah, don't listen to me. Listen to all the other people that I get this info off. Like, I'm a journalist.
I think there might, I don't know if I'm like saying crazy stuff here, but I think there's something to the fact, Angus, you said your degree is in journalism. Drew's bachelor's is in business, if I remember correctly. And my bachelor's is in international relations.
Minor in African studies. Just throw it in there.
So that was the other part of so the one caveat, I dropped out of my journalism degree in the last semester to go on tour with my band, because I realized that being a journalist, it wasn't a protected title. So like, if you had your shit together, you just start doing the damn thing. In hindsight, I should have hung around for another 6 months to graduate, but like, it felt like a once in a lifetime opportunity.
Well, what it makes me think of, because I had like an 8-year career in military intelligence, which on the surface can seem like an impressive, because like we have some big fancy buildings and lots of technology and a big budget and all this stuff.
It's called intelligence.
Yeah, it's intelligent.
But it is also an industry where we're making everything up as we go. And so like being able to come into this world with like a perspective from somewhere else where you realize that like maybe not everything is set in stone and there is a bit of figuring it out. Like I think there's some advantage to that perspective.
Even though intelligence is emerging, it's like we've been spying on people for way longer than we've been trying to train people. So again, even though those systems are emerging, they're a bit more sophisticated and we probably have more reliable heuristics there. And again, like my biggest passion academically before I got into fitness was economics. And again, outside of John Kiley, I would say my biggest influence on the way I program is Nassim Taleb. You know, economics is all about just managing resources at the end of the day, and that's ultimately what we're doing with training planning and stuff like that. And again, people will say like, well, we've got all this data on how economies have behaved before, so if we intervene like this, we're going to get this result. But again, Nassim Taleb understands what a dynamic complex system made up of systems is, and he knows that again, you just sort of can't predict it like that. And again, human beings are the same as an economy, just systems made up of systems.
Well, we now have a business school grad running Great Britain, so things should be fine, I think.
You know, he's also
100%.
worth 730 million pounds, just as a random aside. Like, he's ridiculously wealthy.
Yeah,
So,
I think it's the first time the prime minister has been richer than the royal family.
fun fact.
Sorry, I thought you were talking about Nassim Taleb. I was like, I didn't know he had a bag that sizable. Sorry, now I'm listening
He's
to what
also
you're
the
saying.
prime minister of the UK. But I love that you, I do love that you brought up economics, because that's a parallel that I think a lot of, to Alex's point, like if you grow up in sports science and that's your degree and your advanced degree and all you've ever done, I don't think you recognize the similarities to something like economics. And economics is based entirely off of models and predictive models. And to create those models, they literally eliminate just about every variable so that they can get a nice supply demand graph.
And people are like, the data speaks for itself. I'm like, no, It doesn't. Like I did
Exactly.
statistics at uni and at no point did the numbers just say like, Angus, this is the answer. Clearly, again, it's like, it's these human made models. And like we're going through this evidence-based phase now and don't get me wrong, I am aware and I respect the hierarchy of evidence, but it is my respect and my understanding for like just what human beings are. And this is what Nassim Taleb hates about certain economists. It's like they have all this data and they get so cocky because they're like, it's going to behave the same in the future. And I see sports scientists or these evidence-based cucks as the same thing. Like, I've got all this data. And the thing is, they don't even have much data. We have such a small amount of data. And again, most of the sports science that we have that is saying these hectic things, again, you watch it as we gather more data, it's all going to be watered down and everything sort of just fades back into this mess. It's like, again, sports science is just so bad at telling us specifically what to do. It's really good at like highlighting bullshit and be like, this thing is not the whole thing. Like, I think that's the best we can sort of hope for from sports science. As far as like nailing down, like what's the absolute best thing to do? Again, it's never going to be unshackled from just like being able to think for yourself.
I don't think people appreciate, like, especially people who are like casual consumers of sports science stuff, or like just trying to figure out how to train themselves, whatever, like not necessarily diving in too deep. I don't think they necessarily appreciate how many things we talk about that are essentially unstudied and how hard it is to do halfway decent research on anything in the human performance sphere. Cause it's like borderline / literally impossible to control for enough of the variables to isolate the thing you're trying to actually study.
Yeah, 100%. Injury prevention's the big one. And like now we're having all these, as Franco Impellizzeri would say, evidence-based industries forming. Like how many Nord boards are people going to sell based off that shithouse meta-analysis?
Oh, don't worry. A theme. Like,
We had an episode
I don't
on that.
necessarily have beef with all of the companies in the space, but we here in the United States have one of my favorite companies, which is Sparta Science. And I do have beef with.
Oh God, he said it.
No, I'm happy to air it out. I will say, like the last conference I went to, one of the people came up and was extremely polite to me and like shook my hand. And it was the first time that like one of them has like not been immediately angry upon seeing me in public.
One of them being force plate people.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. But
how much have force plates set you back?
Oh my God, dude.
I mean,
A lot. Okay, more than a Nord board?
Me personally, not so much. The Army, there's definitely a question about how many force plates we have in closets collecting dust.
How can I write a training program if I don't know someone's mid-thigh pull precisely though?
how can you be deployable if we don't know your mid thigh pull? Because heaven forbid you don't produce enough force.
These are the things we need studied. That and another study on squats versus hip thrusts. Like, I just don't know which one to pick.
Damn it. I will like shout out Hawkins Dynamic. I have noticed some people from Hawkins plugging my podcast or this podcast because
Shout out Hawkins. Sponsor us.
It's the willingness to admit that the data itself doesn't do anything. We have a bunch of people, and I already named the company a couple minutes ago, so maybe I'll get fired now. I don't know. But it's the people who are running around claiming, like you said, that the data speaks for itself, which it doesn't. Right.
I love how Franco says he's like, we torture the data until it says something. I'm like, oh, that's so appropriate.
What is it? If bad data supports what you're trying to say, does it become good data?
Yeah, exactly. And if it's not saying what you're saying, it's like, try another model,
Shake it a little. Yeah.
I'm so grateful for people like Greg Knuckles and Franco and Pellizzeri who actually do read because people like read the research. I'm like, yep, there's reading it, but then there's also checking the statistical analysis, which I at least know I can't do. And I hate that about the evidence-based industry that we live in, whereas like, most people study an online cert to get into this thing. And we're like, well, you better do your statistical analysis to figure out if you should do squats or hip thrusts. And they're like, fucking what? Like, we've got all these idiots who are like, look at the data. And it's like, they don't know what they're looking at. Stop telling them to look at the data. Stop telling them to go on PubMed. They need textbooks. They need secondary sources. Like, Jesus, help these people. And again, in a perfect world, everyone would be a genius with a PhD in statistical analysis, and they'd be able to sift through the data themselves. But 99% of trainers can barely read. So I'm just grateful that they'll even pick up a secondary source of scientific information. People are just, and I'm a pretty utopian guy at times as well, but it's so utopian to be like, wouldn't it be nice? And it's just a classic, wouldn't it be nice if everyone could read all that research to inform every single training decision? Or wouldn't it be nice if we actually had robust bodies of evidence? But again, we're so insecure about the shit place that this industry has come from that we're hoping that sports science can do the work for us in like 10 years. I know sports science has been going on for longer than that, but speaking to this evidence-based era where it really has been a central focus, it's like, man, in 50 years, we're going to have some decent data. But again, I think when we get the data, what you're going to see is that you don't get as many clear answers. Again, the data is just going to be all over the place until you torture it, pin it down, and just shape it and massage it. It sort of shows you that you need a Nord board and a bunch of force plates and a specific diet to match up with your whatever. And
I mean, one of the frustrating things for me is that like how much of that literature falls apart immediately when you start to take like a serious critical look at it. Like, take the time. It doesn't take that long to learn like how to interpret an R-squared value or a P value or like whatever the tools are. You need
the
to
t-tests and z-scores absolutely cooked me back in the day.
But like, take the time to like vaguely understand it, and then like look at the citations people are providing you when they're making a particular argument. Because one of my proudest social media achievements was getting blocked by John Russin, and it was because he like was making this claim about like the heritability of obesity and like how big a role parents play in it or whatever. Which like if he had made that as like broadly the point, that would have been fine. But instead, he chose to post really specific numbers. And I'm like, oh, cool. Like, can you provide a reference for that? And his first response was like, go do your research. And I'm like, hold on. Like,
I don't need to
you're making like a really specific claim about something that's like pretty fuzzy in the data. I would love to know where you like got this actual claim from. And then he provided this quote unquote reference. And I opened the thing, and like, not only does it not back up the numbers he's claiming are true, the study's not even about what he says it's about. Like, it's not actually looking at the heritability of the thing.
He probably didn't think you were going to click on the link.
I think that's what it was. I think there was a reliance on the fact that like the social media community at large will never actually like open up this stuff and read any of it.
Evidence-based practice in terms of social media is a performance. It's not about reading research. It's just about citation dumping or like, shout out to No Bullshit Physio, a guy who actually reads research. He introduced me to the term gish galloping. Again, she's like, hey, you want numbers? And you just throw so many numbers and PMIDs at him. You're like, all right, good luck reading through that. I think it actually emerged from legal practice. Like if you want to like slow down another legal team who you think is under-resourced, you quote unquote gish gallop them into submission. Just give them so much evidence and so much shit to sift through that they'll be incapacitated.
When you said no bullshit physio, I assumed you were talking about Adam Meekins, but there is a separate guy who's
there's
no
a literal
physio.
guy. Yeah, great name for you. It's Alexi. It's written Alexis. I believe it's Alexi.
Okay.
Is he a comedian too?
Yeah, he's a funny guy. Yeah,
That's awesome.
I remember sitting in grad school and we had a guy, I won't name him, not that he listens, but he worked for the local
even more reason to slander him. Okay.
Yeah, right. So I went to grad school in the UK, and we had the guy from the local professional soccer team come by to talk about program design, and we had to build out a program for a hypothetical, athlete, and we could not put something into the program unless we had a study to support the movement being in the program. And so when I think of the evidence-based stuff, like I get it, and I've heard it described as like evidence driven or data driven, which I can get behind that. But you do now run into these two camps where it's like you either one are proud of the fact you can't read and refuse to touch literature because like, screw that. I just go off of the color of my sweatpants and the fact that the athletes get hype when I turn the music up. Or two, I'm super evidence-based. It has to be researched. It has to be peer reviewed. Otherwise I'm not touching it. And like somewhere in the middle ground, you have people that actually know what they're doing and kind of laugh at these two extremes. And that's when I think evidence-based, like that's where my brain goes.
And I think, because I think there'd be people who are listening to this cringing because they do, like you said, they actually understand what evidence-based practice truly is, but it just has been turned into a buzzword. And a lot of people are never going to understand that it is that intersection of all those different pieces of evidence. It's not just RCTs and things like that. I think what helps me stay grounded in my practice is I refuse to view training as a science. And I refuse to view any of these things. Like it's always the intersection between art and science. And ultimately they are the same thing. And I think it's a sign of how primitive this industry is that we are in this phase of viewing it as a science. But when you look at a lot of fields, they started off where we were sort of viewing them as hard sciences until we developed effective and practical heuristics. And then you look at the way they're practiced nowadays and people view them almost purely as an art form, but only because the scientific heuristics and principles we developed for those industries are so useful and so effective. So I would point to cooking, which again, everyone knows that that's a science at the end of the day, but again, it's also undeniably an art form. And music as well is very, very scientific and underpinned by maths. Shout out Pythagoras.
Long-time listener.
But, because the heuristics and principles we've developed for it these days, again, we look at musicians these days as artists. We don't look at them as like playing with all these scientific and mathematical principles, but they are. It's like I said, it's just, that's sort of what I've noticed in a lot of fields. It's like they sort of go from a science when they're really primitive to then once you have the good scientific rules, everyone just uses it as an art form. It's like, no, they're still practicing science. It's just this different end of it.
Man, I gotta pause to absorb that philosophically.
No, because I'm sitting here thinking about
that's
it.
That's what my book's about. I'm writing a book now on that. Because I can't, you just talk about how I can like make a quick quip an Instagram post. Like I haven't even touched on that topic on Instagram because I'm like, what's the hot take? What's the headline in this?
The Music of Human Performance by Angus.
Oh, so naming the book is going to be fucked.
There was a post you put up a while back, maybe it wasn't that long ago, about CrossFit. And I shared that with a lot of people. Specifically, I think it was the lesson of, or not the lesson, but this idea that like CrossFit or functional fit, whatever you want to call it, brand, whatever, people bash it. This idea of GPP, this idea of, we talked about interference effect, this idea of non-optimal. My point is, my background is in that functional fitness kind of CrossFit-y space, this idea of, I mean, we'll call a spade a spade. It is a lot of randomness. But if my take from when you posted that was that a lot of your ideas about good training, you're a big GPP guy, come from that space. So I'm curious about your takeaways on that. And then if you got any kickback from the industry when you kind of threw that out there.
let's look at real sports for a second. And I say CrossFit is a real sport. I'm saying like a lot of people just think they understand the human body and they just lived their whole life in a gym. I'm like, pay attention to sport, right? Because people undertake S&C programs that are heavily planned and periodized, and all the stresses are heavily controlled. But like, you can't tell someone how hard they're going, or you can't predict how hard someone's going to play soccer on the weekend, because the game just happens to you. Sometimes you have a hard game, sometimes you have an easy game. But again, people sort of progress their training irrespective of that. And I sort of view CrossFit as the same, right? It's like there's so much chaos in there in terms of like their WODs and stuff like that. But like, all you really need is a little bit of structure to then make it a relatively consistent stimulus. Like, not an explicitly consistent stimulus, a relatively consistent enough stimulus to satisfy some sort of stress response that leads to a positive adaptation. And I think once you sort of, again, go from like, not what's optimal, but again, what have I seen work? And you're like, okay, I've seen these people who just have some semblance of structure, some level of consistency, not absolute structure and absolute consistency. And then once you open the door to then like, okay, then how much of this do I need? That's when you're having a much more productive conversation. And that's when you can understand how both that Russian weightlifter who had the training planned out 12 weeks in advance did get progress, but you can also explain then how the Bulgarians got progress and how these CrossFitters can make such great progress. And I think, you know, if you're snatching less, or you're less fit, or you're less jacked than a typical CrossFitter, again, people are like, steroids, but that's a boring conversation. Go take steroids if you want. Yeah, you can start to sort of reconcile some of those training practices and actually understand what works versus like what's all just like lip service and what's all just a performance of a coach.
Well, one thing I find kind of frustrating. So like, I've said this before on my platform, but bodybuilding and powerlifting have like way too much influence over the broader fitness world.
That's why you got to do power building. You just combine.
Yeah, then they combined forces.
Don't even
like, which it was cool. It was a vibe.
Deadlift and then curls.
But like, part of my whole platform is the idea of like the importance of measuring what you actually need to measure, right? And we have entered this world where strength is only measured in your 1 rep max barbell back squat and your 1 rep max barbell deadlift and your 1 rep max barbell bench press. So like, if those are the measures of success, if those are the measures of performance, the MOPS, then of course the tools you're going to employ are those things, except that most of the people training with that tool are not actually training to compete in those movements at all. And it seems like it's such a stretch to get people to like break out of that framework and think about the fact that like what you're preparing for is kind of vague and kind of complex and kind of varied. Maybe the way you prepare for it should also be those things, and they don't need to be as like narrowly defined as that sport over there that's ultra specific.
What you said there really resonates with my personal experience in this industry, because I really became what I would call a fitness conservative, especially from a movement perspective, coming into this industry. Because I came into this industry, again, there was the Poliquin thing. And we're also sort of having this big functional training hangover. All the Bosu ball thing had just happened. And again, my whole understanding of functional training was just standing on unstable surfaces, trying to do a million things at once. And then that led to me when I found like a bunch of people who just squatted, bench, deadlift, or like picked 1 to 3 movements. Like, that's all I need to get strong at. I'm just going to use these things as my markers of progress. I fell into that trap as well. And it wasn't until I started drinking all this compression expansion Kool-Aid that I then started exploring, again, functional training, horrible term, but again, let's say more diverse movements. Because again, I became one of those, no, just stick to the basics. And like, yeah, you can just stick to the quote unquote basics. Like, and again, the idea that the basics is only squat, bench, and dead, I think that's another misnomer. But yeah, like, I'm sympathetic to that emotional space that people are in. But again, I think it is just this knee-jerk emotional reaction to the OG functional training. Whereas now I think we're having almost this like functional renaissance, for lack of a better word, where like you're saying, I'm like, oh no, you can pick whatever movement. It can even be something that might seem a little bit strange to other people. Like, I thought Zercher split squats were a meme exercise, but I'm like, no, you can actually use them as one of your key drivers of progress if you want. Like, it's a great progressible exercise. Again, people wouldn't say it's one of the basics, but I'm like, it's pretty fucking basic.
Well, I'll throw, because you talked about the Bosu ball stuff and like the functional hangover.
Specific example. I've just got a boner for Zerchers. Got to stay on brand.
Well, no, don't worry. I had a list of like things to throw at you if we needed to keep the conversation going, and Zurch's is one of them.
Zurch's is one of them.
But we can come back to that in a second, because you triggered me with the Bosu ball thing, and I've thought about this a lot, right? Like, so like one of the core, like Eric Cressy's a known name in the field, and he constantly points to his thesis, like his master's thesis that was on Bosu ball stuff. But it was
really,
yeah, right.
Who was Bosu? Is Bosu a person?
Oh,
Right?
no, because I am about to. So I love David Weck, and I'm about to come in swinging for David Weck. So,
but let's go back before we even do that to like actually reading the research before you decide what it's telling you. And like, of course, if you put people on Bosu balls a lot and then test them on whether it improved their linear speed, it's probably not going to make a ton of sense. That doesn't mean Bosu balls are bad. Like I wouldn't.
It's almost a scientific straw manning of it.
Yeah, it's exactly what it is. It bothers me so much.
Yeah, what the fuck? Is that what they test? Like just staying on a Bosu ball, make you run faster? Which, to be fair, maybe David Weck has said. I wouldn't be surprised. I think. Okay, so and I think, like you were asking, who invented the Bosu ball? Is it just this Bosu company? No, the inventor of the Bosu ball is David Weck. And I think if you can just ignore the Bosu ball, it's really a big distraction from David Weck's central contribution to the fitness industry or the human movement or strength and conditioning space, because all the movement optimists and everyone who has their shit together in fitness, in my opinion, is on this like, oh, the spine can bend. Oh, spinal flexion isn't the end of the world. Like there's all these joints in your axial skeleton. Maybe they should actually move. You know who was saying that since day one? The same guy who put 20 Bosu balls in every fucking gym. And no one, like, and that's the thing, David Weck is such a meme to people. I'm like, when will people give him his flowers? He's the OG fuck core stability guy. He is so, because again, the core stability thing was just one of the original evidence-based gaffs. Like same as we've got the new evidence-based gaff, which is the whole Nordics prevent hamstring injuries and stuff like that. Again, we had the core stability thing. We're like, look at all this data that says if you get your TVA going, oh, your back's all sweet. And then, you know, more data emerges over time. Turns out it's more complex than that. Again, ignore the Bosu ball. David Weck is the OG. The spine can move because there's joints there, guy. And now people just view him as this joke. And I'm like, well, that man who you think is a complete goose and who you think is an idiot, it's like, he saw that. It's sort of gone, yeah, like I said, spinal engine. And shout out to David Weck. Come on my podcast, please.
Shout out Bosu balls.
Shout out Bosu balls. Dude, how much money did that guy make? Like every commercial gym in my home country, like Australia, has 20 Bosu balls in them. Not what, like, think about, okay, every gym.
It's a rack of them,
hectic fitness product. Every single commercial gym has like 20 to, the gym I worked at out of Sydney would have had like 80. Man.
But it's force plates though. You got to go force plates, not Bosu balls.
That's the thing. Yeah,
force plates.
More stability. Force plates. Measure the mid thigh pull. Then all the answers come from just extrapolating that data onto everything.
Well, I want to close out what I was saying before, because I had to pull up the study just to make sure I wasn't making stuff up. And I was wrong on one. In my head, I thought it was baseball players, but it was soccer players.
How dare you?
N equals
soccer
10.
Players do love the Bosu, so it's probably an important study for them.
But what bothers me about
and
the study is that the outcomes they tested for were counter movement jumps, 40-yard sprint times, 10-yard sprint times, and T-test agility times. Why would you, like, if I trained somebody on agility for like 10 weeks and expected them to be better at balance, you'd think I was stupid. But we train somebody on balance for 10 weeks and then are surprised when they're not better at speed and agility. That's supposed to mean that the device used in the balance stuff is bad.
Dude, so much research just gets done because someone wants a master's degree or a PhD.
Yeah,
and I think
100%.
more people need to acknowledge that. It's like, shout out, like, I haven't contributed to the body of evidence. Like, and I am so grateful for people that put out meaningful research. But like, man, how many people would be like, go do something to get a master's? Be like, all right, do Bosu balls make people run in a straight line quicker? And it's like, I think David Dweck's whole contention would be that we do move in a straight line at all. Not that, well, he probably is also saying that Bosu balls make you run quicker. But yeah, that's not something I love Weck for, I guess.
That is so true about, I mean, not to bash peer-reviewed, maybe this is I don't know, but you do, if you just go up on PubMed, just the sheer amount of studies that make absolutely no sense and people just want a degree is asinine.
Again, stop stop, and this wasn't master students, this is legit researchers, stop studying squats versus hip thrusts. Stop it. Have some self-control. It's a dumb question to ask. Like, stop it. But people are like, but look at the data. Look at the data we got. We even did it on a trained population. I'm like, I don't care. It's a dumb question. Research something else. Contribute to the progression of this field. We do not need another squats versus hip thrust study because no one's sitting there on a Sunday night updating their programs, be like, squats or hip thrusts. Like, that's not like a thing. Sorry, it is. There's some idiot sitting there, probably because he read that he's like, better check the research. And then he gets derailed because he's like, oh my God, there's like fucking 20 papers on this. I must go through all of them.
Where would you, let me ask you this off the back of that, where would you like to see more research?
Oh, it's so hard. I want to see people try to perform more qualitative research, but it's just so hard in this quantitative data-driven world. And I think that's where I stop my criticism of evidence-based practice and sports science. I'm like, man, it's hard and it's such a challenge to do good and helpful sports science, and we're so under-resourced. And so that's where I go a bit more quiet. I'm like, there are a lot of fucking issues with evidence-based practice and the way sports science is being done currently, but then fixing them is like, it's like when people like, capitalism's not the perfect system. I'm like, it's definitely not. Like, there's so many issues with it. It's like coming up with something better or an alternative to any sort of, again, political system, or it's so hard to be like, what do we actually do with this? Because again, I like the evidence-based era more than just the full bro science era. I'm like, this is better. But again, as a lover of this industry, I want to critique it to sort of keep trying to push it forward. But where it's going to go, again, I guess it's pragmatic evidence-based practice is ultimately what we want to endeavor for. But what that looks like in terms of an RCT that then you go and conduct to get your master's.
Well, I'll lay mine out here, and I think it's very relevant since you said you identify as a personal trainer rather than strength and conditioning coach. But I think like where the gap is for a lot of this stuff, especially as we're trying to generalize things that have been researched in competitive athletes in very structured environments, and we're trying to apply it to people who are just out living their lives and trying to like figure out some training to be healthier and fitter and stuff. And where I think we've missed it, and lots of this stuff is being researched by psychologists, and I got that, but I don't think there's a ton of research in what interventions get people to care more. And I think that's the biggest thing we deal with. Cause like we can tell people facts about nutrition, but they're unlikely to change the way that person eats. Or we can tell people facts about squats versus hip thrusts, and that's unlikely to change the way they train.
Yeah, you got to spin that good story. That's why journalism helps. Storytelling.
It is what it is though. Like that, I think that's at the core of this, and it's uncomfortable for people who want to like operate in a world of math and X's and O's and Excel spreadsheets to realize that probably more important than all of that is the story you tell and whether you can get them to believe in what you're laying out.
And that feels like charlatan stuff, right? But it's like you have to engage with storytelling to some extent. It can't just be only a cute story. It has to be like a good idea that you then use the story to empower and spread. And the issue is we usually have a lot of the best storytellers in this industry are the biggest charlatans. And again, this could be an ego thing, but again, what I am trying to do is embody those components that lead you to sort of being a benevolent guru. It's like, be a good storyteller. Like, again, I think a lot of quote unquote good or smart coaches are just satisfied to be like, no, I read all the data, but I'm like, well, unless you can spin a good or compelling story around that, you're not really helping anyone.
Again, pausing to philosophically absorb.
We've hit on this, Alex, a ton of times at this point, but it is true that we get, personal trainers, coaches, anybody in this space gets taught the X's and O's piece and then wonders why when they build this perfect thing and like, oh, on Monday we're doing squats, on Wednesday we're doing hip thrusts, everything checks out with the data. And then when they wonder why it falls on its face and nobody shows up to the gym, no one has been prepared to discuss or deal with the storytelling aspect of it. And it's squishy and you can't put it in a spreadsheet. And I think that there's not a question here. I'm just going on a rant, but this idea that like, as a coach, it probably behooves you to spend some time reading some Nassim Taleb or reading some economic theory or some looking at
If
music.
you're really
looking at-
paying attention to where sports science is going, and again, like one of the fields that's chugging along quite nicely, in my opinion, right now, in certain aspects, is like pain science, right? And people integrating biopsychosocial concepts there. And I think that's something where, well, the evidence is telling us that our stories matter. It's supported by the data that our stories matter. And then but I think, again, everyone's just sort of looking at the biopsychosocial lens as this thing that's only for helping people in rehab and pain. I'm like, no. This biopsychosocial lens is something that you can view everything through, like programming through that biopsychosocial lens. And then it's like, oh, no, it is important that, okay, I can write this quote unquote optimal training plan according to the data, but it's not truly optimal until I can tell my athlete a story about why it's going to work and make sure they believe in the story. And then that is the pinnacle of evidence-based biopsychosocial thinking from a training planning perspective, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think it's
a lot of the data that I haven't read, but
no, it's spot on. And we touched on this when we had John Kiley come on the episode. It was this idea of, we get so tied up with, I mean, Hans Selye, I think, is what we talked about specifically.
Oh, Hans, the tobacco industry shill.
Oh, Hans. But the fact that the industry he was in has moved on from that stress science, yet we haven't. And it's like, why are we clinging on to theories and things that don't exist for the very field they were created in the first place? Like, have we not done a critical analysis of ourselves? And we let John riff on that for a while, and it created some pretty hot takes.
Oh, John's amazing. And like, it's weird because you ask him a question and no, this speaks to him being an intelligent person. Like, you notice you ask me a question, I just start talking straight away because I'm a bit of an idiot, if I'm honest. But what I love about John and how I want to be in the future is, like, you ask John a question and there's like 3 seconds of silence because he thinks before he speaks. And I'm like, oh, fuck. Like, no wonder he says the best shit. Like, he's just so humble and he listens and he thinks before he speaks. And I think those are things that I just need to do more of.
I don't know. You got a bigger Instagram platform than him, so
it's a good point. That's what matters in this industry.
Like, I'm not, and that's what I mean. Like, you know, you've got like actual legends of the game, like John Kiley, and then you got full blown charlatans, and then you got me in the middle. It's just like little, like really focused on just yelling and talking a lot and creating a lot of noise. But I like to think I'm at least a bit of a surrogate for some of the amazing stuff that certain really intelligent people in this industry aren't able to market as well. If I can be a mouthpiece for some of those people without shaming myself or shaming them too much, I'm grateful to just fill that role. Because again, who should be listening to me? Like, I get it. But if I can just point you towards some other people and send you down some other rabbit holes, and I'm so content. And that is what I want to do. Like, a few people now gas me up, being like, "You're so smart." I'm like, nope, just found the right sources. Honestly, like, just found the good shit.
That, I mean, we've come full circle to my original question about, like, how do we help people recognize when they found the good shit? Because it's not easy to do.
Because by finding more shit. And I think some people get overwhelmed, but like, they're just going through more sources and getting another source and getting another source and getting another source. The same way they do a meta-analysis. It's like, you be your own scientist. And don't get me wrong, it is just your personal experience and you have all your personal biases. So it's not as accurate, but like, just because you're in control of the pacing of it, I think it is the best sort of way to figure out your own view of training and your own sort of training model, things like that. Yeah, just as many different sources. And like I said, even if you're just a powerlifting coach, or even if you're just a soccer strength and conditioning coach, have a look at what the other people are saying outside of your specific silo and cross-reference it all. Because again, we're all dealing with humans at the end of the day. And that's the common link. And that makes it more similar than different across all of our fields.
I love it. I'm reading a book by, he's an ER doctor, and he talks about, like, the book is all about like mental skills that help you perform in emergency situations. And he has a chapter on cognitive biases, and he has a great line about how, like, when he first really understood cognitive biases, his first thought was like, oh man, it's interesting to like realize that other people's brains have this issue with them. Surely not mine, just other people's. Like, I conceptually understand this. Of course, like, all these other people were struggling with it. I just don't. And it's like, like the battle of trying to like keep in mind your own fallibility as you're like trying to read all this stuff, and like a willingness to be wrong all the time. And it's tough, but like, I think there is something to the whole, I say all the time that like my hobby is starting fights on the internet, but I think there's value to it because you find out what you actually believe by testing the ideas that way, by like having the conversations about the things that are a little bit like touchy. And yeah.
I think the easiest way to accept your own biases is just to realize that subjectivity is all we have at the end of the day. And like, again, objectivity is just another way of saying certainty. But people like science because it's quote unquote objective, but it's not scientific to be certain. So like that's a conflict there that I don't think a lot of people manage well. And again, it's like, again, all science is telling us, if you actually look at it for what it is it's telling us to embrace uncertainty. But again, people just use data to try to give ourselves or gaslight ourselves into having some sense of certainty that this complex dynamic system is going to behave consistently. It's like, well, not very scientific of you in the end.
I don't think people spend enough time looking at like how the scientific method actually works. Like you don't have to dig into the stats and all that stuff. Just like understand what the whole point of the scientific method is and understand that like the things that have like massive bodies of evidence to back them up that are extremely consistent across centuries get to be called theories because there's still an idea that's being tested. And like that, yet we have like something that's been studied one time.
Like you actually paid attention. Like, what does this word mean? What are they actually trying to say here?
But like we miss the forest for the trees all the time. And we're like, oh, I got a study that shows that fact. Check it out. No, that's not how it works at all. Like the whole point of the scientific method is to constantly challenge those things. That's how it works. It exists to disprove whatever you're currently putting on a pedestal.
Science is perfect. It's just like anything that the fitness industry touches turns to shit, including like we fucked up science. Like it's just, we did that fitness industry thing to it where we're like, all right, how can I make money out of this? How can I extract information really quickly? We were just looking for that fast result. And we did that fitness industry thing. So shout out science. We can rub our shit all over that and just leave skid marks all over the scientific method.
Oh man!
Like, yeah, you want me to ignore two of the few studies on Nordics for my meta-analysis on do Nordics prevent injury? No worries, can ignore those. Yeah, 100%.
Oh, I love that.
And people said, "Oh, ooh, meta-analysis, high quality evidence." And it's just like, well, yeah, if it was a good meta-analysis.
What? So I want to, because we've taken up a ton of your time, I want to close it by asking you the corollary to that question, which is, given all of the rabbit holes you've gone down effectively, I might add, what is something that you have doubled down on and that you believe to be more true than perhaps when you started?
Back squats are unnecessary for weightlifters and probably a hindrance long term. Again, that's a long conversation. But yeah, I wish more weightlifters would just quit back squatting because it's not a competition lift, and they program for weightlifting like back squats are a competition lift. They're just an auto include, and I hate that. And I think that triple extension is kind of bullshit just in the way that people sort of view it as just a good propulsion all comes down to triple extension. I'm like, no, have a look. And again, this is why I love gait so much. It's like this concept of like mid stance or like mid propulsive qualities, and it just explaining things a bit more in a more sophisticated and useful manner than triple extension is what we're looking for is sequential proximal to distal extension, which allows you to use your body like a whip. And then we're sort of embodying these components that a lot of strength coaches struggle to balance, which is these concepts of force production, but then also rhythm and timing. And that's what I get from the sports coaches, right? It's like they have this understanding, not necessarily of force production, getting people bullshit strong, but of rhythm and timing, and understanding enough about getting people strong or staying in leverage positions. So yeah, just without me going on a big rant as far as why triple extension's bullshit for a lot of sports where you need to produce force and there's a rhythm and timing or other phases or components to the task, just look into the mid stance or mid propulsive phase of gait and you'll start to realize why, again, triple extension, yeah, it occurs, but it's not the whole show.
Man, this guy's really just tearing down people's idols. Back squat and triple extension.
I have a fetish for it. Like I just, yeah, like I said, just got this big chip on my shoulder. I just want to find as many of these things that people are like, this is the truth. I'm like, actually, I just cast doubt. It feels scientific. I don't read much research, but it feels really scientific. So I didn't stop playing cute about like, I read a lot. I don't immerse myself in the statistics of it. Again, a lot of the time what I'm reading is like, how is this study designed? And then I end up throwing the paper out once I've read that. But yeah, just trying to cast doubt over these apparent heuristics, because that's what I'm trying to get this industry to the point where, it's not going to be me that does it, but I have this view that we're in this phase where we're trying to get to our 8 notes. Like Pythagoras, like music was viewed as a science, and then Pythagoras came up with these 8 notes they worked out based on maths and like perfect fifths and things like that. And then the heuristics are so good, without even understanding the underpinning mathematics and science of it, we can play with these notes so artistically and make all this great art. It's just like, we're trying to get fitness to that point, but we've got some established heuristics in this field that just need to be challenged a little bit more, because I don't think they've been put to the test as hard as they need to be tested.
That's brilliant. I don't think I have laughed as much in a podcast as we did tonight. You're probably gonna have to edit a lot of that out, Alex. I'm sorry.
It's easy to do separate tracks, man. We're good. It's because he's a comedian. He's not a strength coach. He's a comedian.
That's a good point. Thanks so much for coming on, man. I mean, this has been, I can't wait to see what we get out of.
I'm so excited for the response to this episode. We're going to make so many people mad.
Sorry, just don't disclose my address. I don't want any of these army people.
He's in Australia, in case you couldn't tell. Oh, man. Thank you. Hey, guys. Drew here. Thanks for listening to the episode. If you found it useful or enjoyed the conversation, we'd appreciate you giving us a review on the podcast platform of your choice. You can also give us a follow on the Mops and Mo's Instagram. And if you'd like to reach out, send us a message on Instagram or shoot us an email at mopsinmos@gmail.com. Thanks.